the Radio Today podcast with Jen Sederhelm.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Radio Today Tonight podcast. And we are doing things a little bit differently today. I've even had to put on lipstick and decent clothing other than my pajamas. And I'm joined by Steve Ahern, for it has been a extraordinary fortnight.
Incredible.
I don't think we will ever see another fortnight like the one that we have just had. However, before we get to Kyle and Jackie O, there's a few other things for Steve and I to talk about that are rather significant as well. We have the Australian Audio Awards with entries closing in a matter of days. Radioinfo is turning 30. In 2 weeks' time, we have GfK Survey 1 for 2026, which is, dare I say it, going to be the most analysed survey outside of Survey 2. And then we come to Kyle and Jackie O, and indeed, when Steve and I first organised to have this chat, it was significantly less progressed than what it is right now. Steve, first and foremost, hello. Lovely to speak with you today.
Hi, Jen. Good to be on the podcast with you.
So let's start at the beginning and let's talk about the Australian Audio Awards that will be held in May. But for people who've been procrastinating perhaps or sitting on their hands about getting their entries together, there is only a couple of days left.
Yes, that's right. The Audio Awards are about to close. So we're recording this on Thursday. Tomorrow, Friday, the 6th of March, will be the closing date. The deadline is midnight, so the clock is ticking. Now, a big hint. If you have not completed your entry and you're right up against it, go in now when you hear this and register anyway, because you might find that there are documents, audio, and various things that you need to upload. You can upload them bit by bit. So rather than try and get them all together and think about it and maybe miss the deadline, at least register, upload everything you currently have. And if there's something missing, work on it right till midnight and upload it by the deadline. If you've got something in, then we will know that you have an entry in progress. But if you haven't even registered, we won't even know you're interested.
And really important, because I was reading one of our judges, Spencer Howson, commenting that he'd been talking to someone who'd been like, Australian Audio Awards, I hadn't heard about it. These awards are open to commercial, to community, to public broadcasters for the first time.
Absolutely, and that's what makes them different, as we've written and has been reported, but, worth saying it again. When the ACRAs were cancelled, and, the whole industry understands they're very expensive and we know why they were cancelled, but to you, to the editor email, to RadioToday, to Radioinfo, we were deluged with calls and emails and texts saying there's very few organisations in Australia who could do something for the whole radio and audio industry apart from you guys. So they asked and we started working on it. And then Tim and I got together, Tim from Umbrella, and now we have the Australian Audio Awards, which is open to every sector of Australia's radio and podcasting industry. We're pretty proud to have done that, but it's a lot of work and it's a risk for us to do it. We don't know how successful it will be. We think it will be. So all I can say is we've done our bit. Now it's up to you, the listeners to this podcast, to do your bit. And there's two things. One is enter and make it a really good competition and make us judges work. And the other one is buy a ticket to the event and make it something special. So they were the two things that everyone asked us for: some kind of competition and recognition and some kind of event where the industry could get together. We've done that. Now it's up to you, people who work in the audio industry.
And just one other additional note, because I've just realised also in our conversations, we often, because the ACRAs were really for the radio industry with only a tiny bit of podcast, this is equally podcast. In fact, there is as many awards for podcasters pretty much as what there is for radio people. So podcasters,
Absolutely.
get your entries in, especially if you've had one that's running for 12 months, have a crack.
Why not? And here's an important thing to know. If by some chance you're not a finalist, then nobody else will know you entered except us in the judging panel, and we're sworn to confidentiality. So there's no risk if you don't become a finalist. People won't know if you entered or not. If you're a finalist, well, that's huge recognition in itself. And if you win, that's even better. Podcasters or radio people, the benefit far outweighs any kind of tentativeness you might have about, oh, should I enter or not?
Yeah, I agree. So it's a really significant milestone for Radioinfo this March.
Yes, it is. Next Monday, the 9th of March, we mark our 30th birthday. Now, the road to starting Radioinfo was long, and it began as a newsletter in 1995. I taught myself how to write HTML code, thought about all the radio columns that were in newspapers, and thought, hey, this new thing called internet could be a good way of being a change agent and disrupting what used to be done and reporting radio in a different way. And that was a bit over 30 years ago. At first, it was slow for the first few months, and there's very few records, even back in my old hard drives, of what I wrote in the first few months. But March the 9th was a time when the Internet Archive system started tracking us, and we can trace it back to there. So we've chosen March the 9th as the day for our 30th birthday, and we're going to celebrate for the whole year. It's our 30th year, and you think about people who've been commenting, writing about the radio industry for 30 years. There ain't that many of them. A shout out to my friend Greg Newman, who used to send out Jock's Journal by mail on paper, and he's now online. He's been around longer than me in this space, but nobody else has had the longevity that Radioinfo has had. It started off as the AMT Radio Industry Newsletter, that's my company name, and then over time, when I collaborated with media heads, Peter Saxon and Peter Rubentine, we changed it to Radioinfo, and it's been known as that since about 1999.
What would you say when you sit there and think back over the last 30 years? What's been a particularly momentous story or meeting?
Well, we're talking in this week, aren't we? So
God,
Kyle
yeah.
and Jackie O would have to be there. The other momentous story was Kyle and Jackie O when they left 2Day FM, and they proved that you could bring an audience with you. And two other stories we covered in similar vein were when John Laws switched stations. He's done that 3 times in his career, and we covered it. And when Alan Jones switched stations, and both of them brought their audience with them. It used to be said that people were loyal to a station brand, but those events proved that people are loyal to personalities as well, or as instead of a station brand, depending on what personality it was. Other big events were CEO changes when Reece Holleran left Southern Cross Austereo and new management came in, and how the wheels turn. Reece Holleran is back as CEO of Super Radio Network now. Good radio people keep coming back. Radio announces the same in our movement section over many years. There are radio people who've left, who've done something else, and then a few years later, or in the case of Mike Byrne, 1 year later, they're back in radio. And that's for 2 reasons. One is because they're good at what they do, and people recognize that, and they offer them jobs. But the other thing is, in my opinion, radio gets in your blood. And when I worked at Afters, I looked for people who just had that feel of radio in their blood. You couldn't get them away from a microphone. They just had to be talking, performing, playing music, talking about music, whatever it was. And they were the best students. And there are quite a few of those now on air in radio who are always there because radio's in their blood.
I am always astonished at some of the people who pop up, and you'll just see somewhere, 10, 15, 20 more years ago at Afters. It's so significant you ever get to go into the Afters building, that they have the group photos from all those years ago, and you sit there and go, oh, that person's here, that person's there. It really has been a benchmark for the industry. And I have to just
So
say
right.
for you too, like
Well, thank
radio
you.
being in your blood. We had a conversation just the other day, and your glee over getting to do the new technology, like your utter delight over everything that changes and how much joy that still gives you is evident 30
Oh,
years
that's
on.
nice. And it's so true. I love the technology. I love the evolution. There are ups and downs. It's a tough time at the moment, but look at how this industry is reinventing itself. So I love it. I love chronicling what's happening. And talking of afters, look at what's happening in the Sydney market at the moment. You've got Tim Blackwell on Nova Breakfast with Ricky Lee, afters graduate. At the moment, you've got Smallsy on Kiss Breakfast, filling in for the missing Kyle and Jackie O, afters graduate. You've got on the weekends Chris Page, who was on Breakfast at Triple M for a while and now is doing a weekend show, afters graduate. You've got Lisa Leong, who does the Working Life podcast for ABC, afters graduate. You know, that there's just 4 significant people in different roles, 3 of them on Breakfast in Australia's biggest market, and they're the ones that just come top of mind, just thinking of it spontaneously.
It's significant, but 30 years is quite extraordinary. And I find even chatting today, when we are clearly in another period of some kind of major reinvention, doesn't it feel serendipitous?
Yeah, it does. And, you know, I've been looking at trends, writing about it, of course, and talking about it around the world at conferences. You know, people, the doomsayers, usually people who run other media who want to take money away from the audio industry, the doomsayers say radio's dead, radio's doomed. Look at all the public companies. Yes, their revenue's gone down. Of course, advertisers have more choices. But look at the bulk of their revenue. In most cases, 80 or 90% of the revenue is still coming from mainstream broadcast radio. And we're seeing podcasts and advertising on streaming at 10 or 20% of company revenue. Yes, broadcast radio is not growing, but it's still a huge base for the success of these audio companies as they reinvent themselves and move into the new area, the areas of growth, which is podcasting and streaming and all the other elements of audio that can be commercialized.
Thursday, March 19 is GfK Survey 1 for 2026. And it's been a little bit confusing because we had a survey released this year, but of course that was the last survey for last year.
I'm still getting my head around it.
Me too, but I am glad for the change. I feel like having it come out in January is a nice way for the presenters to come back to work. I think it's in the right place now. Having this first survey of the year with everything that changed at the end of last year and the significant changes that have happened in the last week, this is going to be a really significant result for Sydney especially.
Yes, absolutely. Last week, the week of the Kyle and Jackie O on-air incident and her then not being on air Thursday and Friday, was the last week of the field work for Survey 1. So there will be an effect. There was a bit of chatter leading up to that as well, but it's only 1 week out of about, I haven't got it in front of me, but 8 or 10 weeks of field work. I think that will give KISS a bit of an uptick because when people are talking about a show, then that often helps. But we won't see a huge difference just based on Kyle and Jackie O in Survey 1. There'll be other factors. I think the biggest factor in the Sydney market will be Christian O'Connell, and Christian is also on air in other markets, so I think there'll be a Christian effect there. I think there will be an effect on Gold Drive as well with Jonesy and Amanda and the change there. The rest will probably show us that the new shifts are building an audience, which would be expected. Probably won't be a lot of change in those shifts first off. It could well be a survey that is not too different from Survey 8, except for Gold. But of course, now we're in week 1 of the field work for Survey 2, and there's 2 weeks for Kyle to show cause in the legal sense for his contract dealings, and then whatever fallout comes from that. So Survey 2 will be full of focus on Kyle and Jackie O breakfast on KISS Melbourne and Sydney. No doubt about that. That will cause churn across all the stations, particularly stations between 10 years and 54 years, because KISS has a significant listenership there, and those people, some of them will go searching for something else. Even if they come back to KISS, there'll be a lot of churn.
Yeah, and there's some new something else's to check out. And again, if we focus on Sydney, Nova has a new breakfast show. Well, a shifted show, so it's not entirely new. Even today is different than
2
what it
days
was.
breakfast with Nathan Emma is still pretty new, and they're sounding quite fresh. So somebody goes there to sample, they might like what they hear. Yes, it's a moment. You know, in managing radio stations and radio programming strategy, if you're a challenger against a big 1 or 2 super brands that dominate the ratings, you know that almost nothing that you do is going to make a dent in those super brands. You can change your shifts, you can put up billboard posters on the road advertising who's there and getting your station name out there. You can give away $1 million in cash, which may bring you a short-term bump, but it's almost impossible to challenge super brands. And in some of our cities, we have that. In other cities, there's a lot more closeness. So as a programming strategist, if you're in that situation, you just have to build a solid radio format with good music, the right personalities. You have to build them slowly. You have to get a good base of a reasonable cume. And then you have to turn that into more time spent listening, and you have to wait for the wheels to fall off something, and then you reach out and you grab those listeners as best you can. That's what's going to happen in the next few surveys because of this instability, both Kyle and Jackie and also Christian O'Connell too.
And that brings me to Kyle and Jackie. And I'm going to assume that most people who have tuned into this podcast today are across what has happened and why it's happened and where we are today. One of the things that they may not be across is that in between the period after Jackie stepped off air, what we didn't know was, well, we didn't know what was going to happen up until now, where we had this 2-week period of again, we don't know what's going to happen from here, but it does really look like it is all over. But Kyle reached out to you, Steve, for the only conversation, except for what he was saying on air, on the record, about what had happened. And I just wanted to ask you about how that happened and your reflections now on that conversation.
Well, I've been around for 30 years doing this, so I guess I'm a recognised personality, and hopefully people know that we try and play a straight bat in our reporting on Radioinfo. So I was delighted when Kyle was happy to go on the record. We know that Kyle also spoke to Craig Bruce on his podcast, but Craig himself said that some of the conversation was off the record. So Kyle rang me back after I sent him a text saying, would he like to talk? And he rang me back and he was happy to be on the record. I didn't record the conversation just out of respect, but I took good notes and I sent him back the words that I'd written down from our notes for him to check. In our conversation, he was very personable, very forthright, as he is, and what we reported was a fair reflection of what was said. Everything that was in our story is an accurate reflection of a Kyle Sandilands on Tuesday who had realised that he'd gone too far. At first he thought it was part of the act. Then he came to realise that he'd really hurt Jackie, and Jackie didn't reply. And he realised that it was much more significant and there was something else happening, as he put it, recognising that Jackie somehow had had a change of heart or a change of sentiment. Maybe she thought enough is enough. We don't know. I haven't spoken to Jackie, so I don't want to speculate. But for whatever reason, Kyle genuinely thought when he spoke to me that they could make up, that management was involved and, perhaps there'd be some kind of mediation conversation or whatever, and that they would make up and continue on. He sounded to me like he was ready to pull his head in a bit. He certainly was ready to do whatever was necessary to make his best friend and someone he describes as being family, make her comfortable again with working with him. Now it has gone to a matter of legals. Suddenly the shutters come down on what people can officially say while a process like that takes place. So for the next 2 weeks, you're going to read and hear and see a lot of speculation, but it's a legal period. ARN have given Kyle 14 days to respond to their intention to cancel his conduct for serious misconduct. And so that will now be locked down, shut down under legal letters back and forth. And at the end of that 2 weeks, we will know what will happen. Behind the scenes, there'll be lots of angst, lots of people issues, lots of people worrying, and that's going to be difficult. But officially, when you're in this kind of legal period, the shutters come down on what can be said publicly. I think the interesting speculation will be what else could happen after that.
It's coming from all angles, isn't it? What was in your article that I don't know has been especially commented on elsewhere, and I think a really significant point of this discussion that all networks should be aware of is that I hadn't realised that Kyle was broadcasting from home that day. And Steve, you will know some of the nuance that is lost when you aren't face-to-face. Especially when someone is unhappy, that you may not pick up on when you are not sitting right in front of that person. So that was relevant to me because I felt very much like I could hear how upset Jackie was, but it certainly didn't feel like Kyle had taken seriously or felt it himself.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why he told me that he was broadcasting from home. And you're right, it hadn't been mentioned elsewhere.
And lots of radio announcers are doing that at present, where one of the team is a long way away from the rest of them. And I just always feel like that does impact not just the relationship within the room, but what listeners hear in return when you're having a not genuinely face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the perfect flexibility is sometimes you need to not be in the studio. So as one-offs, I think the technology enables great flexibility that we didn't have in the past. But I agree with you. I think the best rapport comes from two people sitting across from each other, looking at each other, laughing at each other's jokes, giving hand signals, all those things that we do in a live studio.
You and I, Steve, we met up face-to-face last week and had a discussion in the days when Jackie was just simply off air for however long. And you will know that I very staunchly advocated for Jackie that it was for real, it wasn't a publicity stunt, etc. I got on my feminist high horse about it.
Yeah, rightly so.
And I have sat now where we are right now. I want to ask you right now whether you think that this still could be a publicity stunt, because hypothetically, if it is, Steve, it is the biggest that will ever affect Australian media.
So true. Look, if it is a publicity stunt, number one, they're smarter than me and most other people in the industry. And number two, you're right, it will be one of the biggest stunts ever, probably bigger than, and Kyle will appreciate this because he loves the history of radio PR stunts, it'll be bigger than the 2SM stunt of putting a jumbo under the harbour bridge. And it was all the time when jumbo jets were started, people thought there would be a jumbo jet flying under the bridge, and Ian McRae put an elephant on a barge and sailed it under the bridge. You know, that ranks as one of Australia's great radio stunts. If this is a stunt, this will eclipse that. It would be huge. Personally, having heard Kyle, I don't think it's a stunt, but who knows? If it is a stunt, it might be an interesting way of legally breaking the current contracts and allowing all parties to renegotiate. If so, amazing. Personally, I don't think that's the case. I think Kyle was genuine in that he had said the wrong thing, he regretted it, and he was really surprised with Jackie's reaction. But, it was a phone conversation, and I wasn't sitting across from Kyle either, so I couldn't read his face. My instinct is that at least two of the parties wants to break the current contract. They've all realised that $10 million each a year and $200 million locked in for 10 years is not the right business deal for the current radio environment. And I reckon probably everyone wants to break those contracts. Now, if they break them and they all go their own way and do different things, that's one result. Or if they break them and work out a reset and reset again and stay with ARN in a different form on a different salary, then that would be an amazing outcome too. As to what the possibilities could be, I think one of the most significant ones is Kyle's approach to what he might like to do in radio in the future. I looked back at another one of our old interviews on Radioinfo in our 30 years, where Kyle spoke to Peter Saxon, our editor at the time, and said he really admired Howard Stern because Howard Stern was under the pump from the broadcast regulator in America, and he moved to satellite radio, which was less regulated. We know also that Kyle is an admirer of the Joe Rogan podcast, and podcasting is the new unregulated audio environment. So if Kyle doesn't go back to a daily breakfast show, then I reckon he'll be into a talk podcast. If he does, I reckon that'd be a great pickup for any radio network to pick up and broadcast with someone to edit the content for broadcast radio after it's been on the podcast platform. That's one of the possibilities I think could happen, but there's lots of ways it could be mixed and matched. Another thing that people have commented on in our comments section is, what about Jackie? Somebody said she'd make a great 2-day FM breakfast host, going back to the roots before Kyle and Jackie left 2-day, took their audience with them and went to Kiss.
Oh, there's so much in that to unpack. But I fundamentally agree with what you said about that there are parties who definitely couldn't have the contract continue as it is. I mean, what's actually surprised me already, I don't know what I was expecting, but ARN share price has gone up a lot. And
Well, of course it is. If you're an investor and suddenly you can see a saving of $20 million worth of expenditure per year, you're going to reward the company for that.
But then on the other side, are they losing something that is too important to lose as well? So that's, I suppose, the balancing out for me.
Absolutely. And, programmers think that way, but shareholder investors who are not necessarily radio people don't think that way. Of course, we know that if your programming goes down, your revenue will go down and eventually the investors will be unhappy. So, of course, there's an element in that. But when it comes to immediate investing of a listed company on the stock exchange, usually the buyers and sellers will reward cost cutting from an investment point of view.
I suspect that next week is going to be relatively quiet on the radio front outside of all of this conversation about what's going to happen from here with Kyle and Jackie O, which will just mean that that story has even more legs than what it has at the moment. Because we're heading towards survey, I can't help but feel that 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a whole new conversation of just, can you believe that this has happened? Now we're looking at this and I never saw this coming. And
I think you're right. And it'll be a very interesting conversation with the new head of programming at ARN, Dave Cameron.
Yes. And that's also on my mind because having gone back through our 30-year archives of Radioinfo, he'd only stepped into the more senior content leader role maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months before Kyle and Jackie O moved over to ARN.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. Wow, that is something worth going back to have a look at because we've been around 30 years and we've reported all those things. I remember that he did an interview with Peter for us, I think, at the time.
He did, and he was, of course, as his role would dictate, he was incredibly excited about the future of Today FM and all the things that Today FM could do once Kyle and Jackie O had left, which unfortunately, as well, most people who will be listening to this podcast will be aware, just have not panned out as SCA will have wanted. And now Dave is over at ARN, hasn't even got his feet under the desk.
And they've left again, possibly.
And
wow, what a
left
full
again.
circle moment for Dave Cameron.
Possibly. So there's something in that too. And I survey day, Steve, I am very interested to hear if you get a chat with Mr. Cameron, who you will have spoken to many, many times in his SCA, with his SCA hat on, whether or not you'll get a ARN conversation.
Yeah, I wonder. I'm looking forward to that. Dave is a consummate radio professional and always fronts up and answers the questions as asked. So I will be very interested to hear what he's got to say.
Me too. So survey, 2 weeks, Thursday the 19th of March. Get your Australian Audio Awards entries in. They are closed this Friday at midnight. And happy 30th birthday, Radioinfo.
Thank you very much. And for you, you're embarking on a trip pretty soon. You're going to be covering RadioDays Europe for us this year. Are you packing?
It's colder over in Riga, so it's in Latvia, which is very exciting. Yes, I am. And I am now going over to Riga holding the biggest story in radio of the last decade in my hands. I just cannot believe what a difference 2 weeks makes.
Listeners may know that I'm involved with the programming committees of Radio Days, and I can tell you that this is not just an Australian story. The whole audio industry in the world is looking at this. We know that from our stats. I can see the readership stats from countries all over the world up in our analytics portal. But more than that, I know from talking to the people at Radio Days on our conference program selection committee that Kyle and Jackie O has been a topic of interest to radio the world over for the last many years, and people have wanted to hear from them. Jackie was at a conference a couple of years ago.
Wasn't it only last year? And she went with Gemma.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it could have been last year.
Yeah.
So many conferences, so many years.
Yeah.
And Kyle had been at a conference in the past too. The world knows these two. They understand the highly successful but controversial format that they do, and they understand the chemistry between them. Radio presenters all over the world have looked to them as examples of what to do and maybe also what not to do, who knows. The world spotlight is on the Kyle and Jackie O show. So you're going to be right there. I'm sure hundreds of people will ask you about it while you're there at Radio Days Europe.
And I'll be able to say I have absolutely no idea. But yeah,
you can say read Radioinfo and RadioToday and you'll follow it as it happens.
Yes, and another 2 weeks is proving to be a very long time in radio land. Steve, lovely to chat today.
And you too, Jen.
Radio Today with Jen Sederhelm. Find more at radiotoday.com.au.